As a special educator in the school system, I have seen and dealt with a lot of school refusal and students dealing with huge emotions. That is our conversation today, and the benefit of truly collaborating and understanding what these emotions and behaviors have for your child and the students that you support. So, as a parent or professional, if you've dealt with school refusal, big behaviors, and you're not sure what to do, if you're nodding yes, you do not want to miss our conversation today with Ariel Kornblum. Welcome to the Special Ed Strategist podcast, where we strategize all things special ed. If you are a new parent to special education or a seasoned parent professional sitting at the IEP table, you don't want to miss this episode. So grab a pen, some paper, cup of coffee, pop those earbuds in, get your walk on, and get prepared to take notes. So again, today I'm talking to Ariel Kornblum, and she is joining us to talk all things with school refusal, big emotions, and even stay to the end where we learn a little bit more about behavior tutoring. I am your host, Wendy Taylor. I'm a mom and a special educator obsessed with helping parents and professionals bridge learning gaps and build kick-butt IEPs. If you want more tips, show us some love on social at Learning Essentials. If you are new to our podcast, give us a like and a follow. Without ado, let's jump in and welcome Ariel. Ariel, welcome to the show. I'm so excited for you to join us on the Special Ed Strategist podcast, and I can't wait for us to dive in and talk about school refusal and behavior. And it really is such a timely fashion that we're having this conversation as we're starting school, and many students have already gotten into school, and I'm sure parents are noticing a lot of behavior. So I'm excited for us to connect and get all of your good information. So thanks for joining us.
I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yes. So let's kick it off. Tell me about yourself and why you are a special ed strategist.
Sure. So I am a dually licensed behavior analyst and a clinical psychologist. And I guess how I got into this in the first place is I always knew I wanted to work with kids in some capacity and in, some sort of a helping fashion. I've always been fascinated by psychology, and I knew that's what I wanted to do. But once I got into graduate school, I decided to do a lot of work in the behavioral space, ended up falling in love with the overlap between psychology and behavioral therapies. And that is why I took on a second degree. So here we are.
We need more of you. We need more of you with all of this great knowledge. So let's start our conversation. Tell me about school refusal and kind of what constitutes a school refusal versus, just feigning illness or playing hooky, so to say.
Sure. So school refusal, super timely, really moment to talk about school refusal. It is, at least in New York, this is now the start of the second full week of the school year. So school refusal is a clinical term. In general, when we talk about things being clinically significant, our rule of thumb is usually to see if something is happening over a 2-week period very, very, very consistently. So if you have a child who is refusing to go to school, and by definition, that means not leaving the house in the morning, either feigning illness or really any other reason, but refusing to get up, get dressed, walk outside and walk into school. And if that's happening, suddenly, whereas that's not something that was there before, and it's happening every single day for a couple of weeks, as clinicians, we would consider that to be, real school refusal.
Let me ask you, because I have a lot of friends with school age children, and then also being the director of Learning Essentials, I speak to a lot of parents of school age children. And it seems, that it's really helpful to have that 2-week marker for parents. I feel like a lot of students come Friday or Monday, all of a sudden don't feel well. So what do we do with that before we get into the deep dive of kind of the 2-week mark, kind of the more intense version?
Sure. So school refusal, and this is a really wonderful place where psychology and behavioral analysis really overlap, is it happens for a reason. So our job as the adults, in many children's lives and, parents too, is to figure out the why. Sometimes it can happen because there's something going on at school that the child would like to avoid. And sometimes we see that, with the Monday and the Friday, maybe there's an activity they don't like, or a kid is giving them a hard time. They had a fight with a friend. They have a test that they're really feeling nervous about. It could also be there's something going on at home that the child doesn't want to leave the house. They would rather stay at home. So big life changes, new baby, there's a parent or a caregiver who is sick and they're feeling nervous about that. In general, we want to understand the why and validate that for our children, right? So, everyone wakes up some days, I don't want to go to work, I don't want to go to school. It's not atypical to be like, I just really don't want to do it today, right? So it's okay to validate, like, hey, some days are hard, or this thing is hard, this test is hard. And in that sense, you can talk through some strategies, right? But the language is really mostly about, school is not optional. If you're feeling okay and you're not sick, you don't have a fever, there's no doctor's appointments, you need to go to school, right? So there is a way to validate, but also to draw a pretty firm line there.
So, in terms of the validation and drawing a line, which psychiatric or emotional disorders are most frequently linked to school refusal? Like, if we're talking about more than just kind of the Mondays and the Fridays.
Sure. So I would say pretty much every psychiatric diagnosable condition could be linked to school refusal at one point or another. The most frequent comorbidity you're going to see is anxiety, right? But also, for example, if you have a child who has a diagnosed learning difference, or maybe even undiagnosed learning difference or ADHD, and that sort of sets off a ripple effect in the school environment, right? I have these things that are difficult for me, and therefore, the transitions at school are hard. The test taking is hard. I have a teacher who, cold calls if I'm an older student, and that's really anxiety provoking. So there are all these things that sort of ripple out from psychiatric conditions that may or may not lead to school refusal at one point or another. But the most typical is certainly anxiety.
So, how do we help our parents with that? I guess recognizing anxiety, and then what would be the steps to help support a parent?
Sure. So it always starts again with that validation, right? My child is feeling anxious. By the way, school refusal is extremely anxiety provoking for parents too, right? You have a kid
Yes.
sitting in front of you, I'm not going to school today, but you need to go to school today. I have a work day. I have this. You can't, I can't, you can't be here, right? Like we have to figure this out. So staying calm is probably like the biggest piece of advice. Just because your child wakes up one morning and refuses to go to school that day, it doesn't mean we have a serious psychiatric condition on our hands, right? Might just be might have been a one-off, right? And we can figure it out. So supporting parents really in understanding and validating and working with their anxious children is a big, big, big part of any sort of psychotherapy for anxious children. So if you are a parent and you know that your child has either subclinical anxiety or diagnosable anxiety, there are lots of resources out there, parenting groups that are focused on treating children through their parents. And that is a really big, I would say actually since COVID, that space has certainly accelerated and picked up a bit. The research is showing us that treating anxiety can really be done quite effectively through treating parents who can then turnkey that into treating their own children, rather than having children come into therapy. That's the first thing. The second thing is parents need to connect with school teams, right? The connection between a parent, a teacher, school support staff is critically important when we're talking about any sort of school refusal. It is the parent's job to validate, to understand, and to get their child to school. But it is the school's job to meet the needs of the child while the child is in school. So it really needs to be a collaborative effort on that front when we're dealing with school refusal.
And I can imagine then with the training parents, right? So then the parents can then go into the school and then be a better partner with the school and developing that partnership and being a team to say, this really is the why with my kiddo, and here are some things that we can do together collaboratively to support them, to get them in school. And then once they're in school, helping them grow and to feel grounded within that.
Absolutely, right? So with school refusal, one of the most important things we'll always talk about is actually physically getting your child into the school building, right? The more days that school refusal goes on, where let's say the child wakes up, they're refusing school, and the parent is totally overwhelmed, doesn't know what to do, right? And allows their child to stay home from school. Now, it's not the worst thing in the world, right? We all need a mental health day every once in a while. I'm a pretty big proponent of the mental health day. And actually, I'll tell parents all the time, sure, your child says they want a day off from school, they're refusing school. Tell them, hey, listen, you got to go today, but we'll plan for it. In next week or in 2 weeks from now, you could show them a calendar. This is a day my work schedule is kind of light. I'll take the day off. We'll spend the day together. I'm a big fan of those sorts of things sprinkled in, but you don't want it to be on demand, because that will sort of build the relationship between your child, thinking they can say, hey, I'm not going to school today. And you are always, going to give in. So once you're working with the school, from there are all sorts of options, right? It might just be you need a quick little, he needs a job at the beginning of the school day. That's going to make him it's going to ease that transition. It's going to make him feel a part of the class, right? I'm a big fan of like the kid who can go to the office and get the mail for the teacher. I think that, pragmatism is very important when you're talking about these things, because sometimes it doesn't take a whole lot to break the cycle and to get that child invested in school. But let's say there really is an issue, right? There is a learning difference. Maybe it is undiagnosed. Through that collaboration with the teacher, you can sort of figure out, oh, he's really nervous about reading. The reading is really getting to him, right? And get the teacher's expert advice on, let's say how he's doing with reading. So from there, you might be talking about, well, maybe this is a child who requires some additional support. Is there an IEP in place, right? Without that initial collaboration, we can't get the insight we need to figure out how to best support the child.
And that's awesome to have that permission for a parent to say, let's plan a day off, and then to coordinate with the school. What can we do that's that hook, that magnet to pull the student in?
Yeah.
You mentioned COVID, right? And that's still top of mind for a lot of folks. How is that playing into school refusal for either COVID fears or just a broader sense?
Wow. I think that there is no way to overstate the impact of COVID on kids, and particularly in the realm of school refusal. So I think as a, collective population, most people will assume, well, COVID restrictions were terrible for kids, right? The lack of the socialization, they weren't in school for a period of time. But I think we're forgetting there's a whole population of kids who COVID restrictions changed their lives for the better from their perspective, meaning I have social anxiety. This is hard for me. I don't like being in school. And suddenly I don't have to go to school anymore, And that first, few months where all schools were closed, it's interesting from a psychology perspective. We started to see lots of kids who were thriving in a remote school environment, right? Suddenly they don't have to talk to other kids. There's no lunchroom. There's no recess anymore. All the things that made them avoid and made them super anxious. Now, clearly that's not the best thing for a mental health perspective, but for them in that moment, it's relief, right? Now you have year 2 where there's a hybrid and there's options for remote school. Those are the kids who struggled the most. Why are you asking me to go back to this? I can do it another way. I don't need to go to school, right? Like I can do school from home. So I think that we are still seeing a significant, hangover essentially from that, of kids who are engaging in significant school refusal because, they got a break essentially from all the things that made them really super nervous for a chunk of time. I think you see that with adults too. The office socialization was never my thing, right? Like I didn't like it. I'm kind of socially anxious, and then one day I was able to do all my work from home, and now all of a sudden you want me to go back to that? Like that's very nerve provoking for me. So I think with kids we are seeing, I would say, like almost like this secondary epidemic of anxiety and school refusal, that has come as a result of just the lifting of COVID restrictions. And I would really, at least in New York City, this is the first year where there's like nothing, right? There's no mask requirement. There's no health screeners. There are, really no quarantine rules anymore. Kids are eating lunch in the cafeteria again. There's regular recess. There's gym. There's all the things that we didn't have for a good couple of years. So COVID has just tremendously impacted the lives of children. And for those with anxiety, it's really, it can make that significantly worse for them.
So, what is your take on all of this in terms of, you mentioned students having the option to do online school. And I know, at least in our district, they've removed that this year. That's not an option. But do you ever chat with parents about looking into that option? Or do you feel like in this particular case with anxiety and school refusal, that going to school is really going to be the best option?
So it's interesting, right? I think that there are silver linings in everything. Now there have been like these online accredited K through 12 and things for a while now, like those predate COVID. And for a period of time, there were kids that was a good fit for. Kids whose families traveled a lot, who were kind of independent in their schoolwork. Maybe they had a medical condition that precluded them from going to school. And I think that there's validity in all of those things. With anxiety, we're always trying to manage it to be in the right spot, right? So what I always tell kids is like, wow, anxiety is part of your biology. Like if you didn't have any, you would just not look both ways when you cross the street. You would talk to any stranger. We need to have some, but sometimes the meter gets out of control and we have too much anxiety and it stops us from doing the things that we need to do. So I think it's about finding the sweet spot there, right? I feel pretty strongly that kids with social anxiety, they need to have some degree of socialization so that they can get used to that, so that they can manage their anxiety. And with online school, I do think that there's a way to figure out a nice middle ground, possibly, where there can still be that social interaction, but maybe it's not the school that has 1,000 kids in a grade and it's very, socially overwhelming. So I think working with parents to find the best fit for their child is good. We want to meet them where they're at. And when I say that, what I mean is what we can realistically push them into, right? Like how can we scaffold a social situation or an anxiety provoking situation where that child can actually find their way through and be successful. If I have a kid who has been home and isolated from all other kids, maybe there's a sibling there, but essentially all same age peers, right? For a good chunk of time. And I'm like, great, I just came back from, my lake house where we didn't see anyone for a year. And now you're going to school with, there are 30 kids in your class and 1,000 kids in your grade, and there's 10 transitions. That might be a lot. Right. So I think that there's a middle ground there for sure.
What's the worst thing parents can do if they begin to notice school refusal tendencies?
The worst thing, it's an interesting question.
Well, we've talked about the best things, right? We talked about like how to notice, ask for the why, meet your child in the middle and think about truly where their schooling lies and what that looks like for your kiddo. And so kind of what's the worst thing that they could do then?
So it's interesting because I think when parents come for, therapy, and I'm speaking as a parent myself, right? It's really hard. Parents often get really down on themselves. Oh, I did the wrong thing. It's my fault. It's my fault. Nothing is permanent. You always get the chance to right the ship when it comes to these sorts of things. But in general, and I think this applies across the board and not just to school refusal, the worst thing parents can do is not be sensitive to their child's emotional needs. I think where some parents are quite quick to say, what are you talking about? You have to go to school. You're going to school. I don't care if you don't like the teacher. I don't care if a kid's being mean to you. You have to deal with it. This is a typical one. Grandma and grandpa would have never let me not go to school. You need to go to school. And just like completely glossing over the fact that there's clearly something there, right? That your child is trying to communicate to you. So not all kids have the words. We talk about this a lot in my practice. I talk about this to any teacher I have ever talked to, most parents, is that anxiety in that pre-K to third, maybe even fourth grade population, that looks like behavioral challenges. And if we can't meet our kids where they're at and figure out, well, like, why is this happening? Then it's worthless to even try to do the work, right? So that is really the worst thing, to not take the time to really understand what is going on with your kid. None of us ever experienced a global pandemic as a kid. Never, right? None of us know what it's like to be 3 years old, to see every adult in your life in a mask, to have to wear a mask yourself, for that just the collective anxiety of the world to be so high. You know those things, they seep into kids' skins, they seep into their brains. And it might be easy for us adults, not even all of us, but some of us, to rationalize and to figure out, okay, here's what's next, here's what's happening. They don't get that, right? So being sensitive, or not, rather not being sensitive to children's emotional health, is probably the worst thing that we could do as adults across the board.
And behavior really speaks to us if we're listening, right? So when our kids,
Absolutely.
either in their classroom or in our home, are having behaviors, if we are able to kind of take an overhead view and think through it, which is certainly hard as a mom of three, in the moment where you
It
just
is. It's
have a
really
lot of
hard.
right? And you have a lot of feels, but they're trying to say something with that behavior. And that kind of leads me into something else. You've talked about behavior tutoring. What is that?
It's interesting, right? So I would have never, maybe a few years ago, that we would have never talked about that as being a term. But there was a time where, I have, expertise in executive function coaching, and we used to get, kids who, we were really looking at the concept of tutoring, right? And I think most people understand tutoring to be like, someone sits with you and helps you understand the academic material, right? But like, what if that's not the issue, right? What if it's, when we think about kids in a classroom, and I actually think remote learning highlighted this so much, right? Kids do not go to school for 8 hours a day and sit in their desks and learn that entire time, right? There are tons of transitions. There's a lot of learning that happens just in the unstructured time. And there are lots of behavioral conditions required for learning, right? Traditionally speaking, we'll talk about sitting and paying attention to the teacher, right? Now, I think that we are starting to maybe turn a corner and understand that sitting is not necessarily required for learning, but we're not all the way there yet. But let's say there's a kid who just doesn't do their homework, can't, where they do it, they forget to turn it in, they lose it, it looks messy, it's not organized. There are all these issues, right? If that kid sits down with a tutor and they talk about division as a math concept, I bet you if that kid didn't really have any sort of learning differences or academic challenges, they would be able to do that problem, right? So I think that we had seen these kids who can sit with an academic tutor and they know the material, right? But the issues that we're starting to see are organizational concerns, some of those behavioral things. I have to do my homework and then I have to upload it. I have to put it in my folder. I have to make sure it gets handed in to the teacher, right? All of these sorts of things are incredibly important. So with behavioral tutoring, you get the mix of both, right? Let's work on the behaviors that increase learning readiness, right? And then from there, let's assess, well, what are the real academic needs? So I think having tutors who can do both is such an incredible resource for parents.
So, with behavior tutoring, do you need a specific background or training? Through educational therapy, we kind of think of that lens as well in terms of the whole child and meeting the needs of the child socially, emotionally, academically, as it applies to the academic realm. We're obviously not getting into the behavioral component in the sense of what you do. So, when we're talking about behavioral tutoring for parents, what does that look like for training?
It's really an interesting question. I think that there can be a little bit of a variety here, right? So I think if we're conceptualizing that there may be some academic concerns underneath the behavioral arena, I'm looking for someone who has some dual degrees, right? Someone who has the academic background, particularly possibly a special education background, and then someone who has some degree of expertise in behavior analysis. So I think in the most ideal world, I would be looking for a duly certified BCBA, who's a board certified behavior analyst, and a certified special education teacher. Now, you might not get both of those things, but I think some degree of advanced training in both of those areas is a really good mix for this kind of work.
And then how does behavior tutoring address learning needs?
I think this is another area where, again, it depends, right? So I think it depends on what, if there has been an assessment and there are already identified learning needs there, right? Sometimes we have that. There's a, psychoeducational assessment, there's a neuropsych, and it has clearly shown that there are learning differences and learning needs there, right? But then we have all the behavioral components on top of it. And actually, some of those behavioral components might be a bit of school refusal here and there or class refusal, right? And parent will come and be like, listen, my child has, maybe they have, dysgraphia or they have dyscalculia. They have some sort of diagnosed learning difference. But on top of that, layered on top of that, they have sort of found their way into some of these behavioral challenges that we feel we need to break through before we can really address the learning differences. It might be that a kid is getting referred for just those behavioral readiness skills, right? We'll do some work. And from there, this is where it comes in to play to have that, special education background. We might be like, I feel like maybe there's something going on here, right? And you can make a referral for an assessment at that point. So I think behavior is usually the most surfacey aspect of everything, right? It's the thing that
Right.
we see first. It's usually the thing that garners our attention, even if there was some indication that there was an issue before that, right? When we get referrals in, through our office, a lot of the times what parents will talk about most frequently, or teachers will, is behavior, right? Whether that's anxiety related behaviors or really just overtly challenging behaviors. It's our job as the professionals to figure out the why, right? That's just the tip of the iceberg, is the behavior. But it can really impact, it can really in a classroom impact a child's ability to access that curriculum, right? So that's what we're looking to break through first, and from there figure out, well, maybe this classroom isn't really a good fit, maybe we need to talk about some other alternative.
So how do we develop goals or measure goals, I should say? How do we develop goals and measure goals for behavior tutoring and supporting students in the behavior realm?
So first of all, with behavior analysis in general, most people who have had any sort of like brush up against a behavior analyst will know that behavior analysts are basically obsessed with data, right? So, there are extremes in any profession, but I would say in my experience, and actually being a behavior analyst myself, it is the one where data reigns supreme, right? We don't do anything without data. So in behavioral tutoring at your outset, right, you're going to have some version of, it could be an informal assessment, it could be pulling from other assessments, but we are creating goals with metrics and taking data over time. Again, collaboration is key here. I am like, in my professional practice, I believe really strongly, I work with kids, but it's not just with the kids, parents, teachers, caregivers. We need everyone on board to make any sort of reasonable change. It is completely unreasonable to expect an 8-year-old to make all these changes in a vacuum and then go out and suddenly, utilize them in their day-to-day life. Setting kids up for success is the best. So we're going to have goals that are not just our therapy goals, right? That data, let's say one of my goals is child hands in homework every day upon entering the classroom, right? Like, let's say that was the issue and we are working on that goal. Clearly, I would need the teacher to assist in that goal, or at least in the data collection to help me figure out if any of the work I'm doing is actually transferring into the school environment. So I think that the onus is on the professionals that work outside the school to really make sure that they are working with the school team for that continuity. So we're going to start with an assessment, something, it could be informal. We're going to have goals and we are going to take data based on those goals. Every behavior analyst will understand the term mastery criteria. All special educators understand that. At one point, we will have to say, well, this child has met this goal. Doesn't mean we never talk about it ever again. It just means it becomes a maintenance goal, and maybe we check in on it every once in a while to make sure that it's being maintained. But yeah, goals like anything else, I actually think a lot of these goals can find and should find their way onto an IEP if we have really good collaboration with the school. That is an ideal world and something that I would frequently push for.
So I know folks listening can't see me, but I'm smiling and nodding and putting my hands in the air because, yes, there's such a parallel there between the special educators and what you do in the behavioral realm that is incredibly important for us as parents and educators and professionals to know is that coordination between care. Right. So you're not operating in a silo, and that the school system's not operating in their silo, that there has to be that collaboration and communication between the two for this really to be effective of what we're doing, whether it's in the behavioral realm, the educational space, however that is, it all works together as that family system for that child to support that child. And so even just what we do in learning essentials, and again, educational therapy and academic coaching, assessing the needs and then bridging that gap, and then at the end with data and being a kind of a case manager for families and providing resources for those families. But the data has to be there, and we know that as special educators, and in your world as well, we've got to collect data, but also pulling in that general education teacher, whomever is the teacher of record at that point for that child, so that they understand how to collect the data, so that then we can better serve the child that we're supporting.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that one of the biggest, and I will say as a field, we are working on this, but one of the biggest pushbacks that, behavior analysts often get is the jargony, complicated nature of some of the things that we recommend, right? So I think that, like, sure, and I talk about this with our group of BCBAs all the time. You could write the best behavior plan and the best goals that if you handed that into your professor, they would give you an A plus because it was just super awesome. But it's not super awesome if you didn't talk to the school about it. And if they can't do something like that. Now you basically it's like you wasted the paper that it's on, right? So I think, special educators, psychologists, behavioral specialists, OT, PT, speech providers as well, it's so important to come back to that collaboration all the time, because in the real sense of an IEP, right? Like, I know that in most IEPs, the way that they are written, right? The speech therapist will write the speech goals, right? Teacher will write educational goals. But in the true essence of an IEP is that everyone who works with that child should be working on all of those goals, parent included, right? That's why the parent is a member of the IEP team. So it is really important that we are constantly coming back to that, because it doesn't matter if you're doing fabulous work outside of the school. If it never makes their way into the school, and school is a metric of progress and success for any child, right? Like, school, that's where they spend the bulk of their day. That's their job. So if you're doing work that never finds its way into the school, that's definitely not good.
So you've kind of set up this of what it looks like when it works really well. Have you been in a situation where you've received pushback from somebody on that team? Again, a school-based team, outside team, family team. Kind of twofold with this question. Have you received pushback? And then what have you guys done or seen in your experience that has flip the script to really help create that team momentum and continue to have that support for that student?
It's such a good question. So for me, my initial training is actually as a school psychologist, and I worked as a school psychologist for a number of years. And in my first year of graduate school, I remember a professor saying to me that the hardest part of this job is the collaboration, is walking the line between sharing your expertise and working with teachers. And I think when you work as a support professional in a school, that you basically get hit in the face with that immediately, right? There is an art to consultation, and one that our team has, we've been really focused. We do a lot of work in schools and a lot of work with schools. So we've been really focused on training our staff to understand, well, how do you do that? And there are certainly simple things. The simplest thing is to remove all the jargon completely. It's so silly. Behavior analysts decided they needed different words for words that already existed. So for example, behavior analysts use the word manned for anything that's a request. When you're talking to a teacher, you can certainly use the word request. That's fine. Everyone knows that. So I think that there's my biggest I think the biggest thing I learned that helps in that domain is to get the teacher's input first. Teachers with that kid way more than you are, right? It's like when we work with parents and therapists will say, well, you are the expert on your child. Sure, I might have an expertise in therapy, but you are the expert on your child. Teachers are the experts on the kids in their class. Teachers are the experts on the resources in their class and the schedules of their day and what they can and cannot integrate. So I think the first thing to sort of flip the script is to sit in a meeting and ask the teacher, what do you think would help, right? That gives you a really good baseline of where you're at and how, like, the potential for the classroom environment to support the child. You might already be, and I have sat in many of these meetings, too far gone, right? You could certainly sit with a team and a teacher will say, this child cannot be in my classroom. They're disrupting everyone else. And I think as professionals, we need to understand, like, that happens, right? It's our job to get there before that happens, but that might have happened. And we need to respect that that is the case. There are other children in the class. It can be certainly draining on a teacher's resources to have a child who is not a good fit in the classroom. And it's okay. If we need to sit as a team and say, listen, this child needs a different placement, right? Or they need more support services, that doesn't mean that we fail. That means we're meeting the child where they're at. So I think that the biggest thing to do is to really take in the perspective of the teacher, and not just like because someone said you had to or it's the right thing to do, but to really take it in and integrate it into whatever plan you're working on.
That's fantastic and such fabulous nuggets for us to take away in terms of the team and meeting the team and really asking the teacher where they see the student, because you're right, they're the biggest delivery of services. And so really kind of getting their input makes it more of a comfortable collaboration than just, oh, they're coming in and telling me I have to do something in my classroom. So I think that's an excellent way to frame it and to phrase it. So let's kind of switch gears a little bit. Why might a child exhibit deficits in social skills?
So many different reasons. Back to the we have seen, I think that the research has yet to be borne out because we're basically like still in some version of a COVID world. But I think that the COVID restrictions are certainly going to delay and impact social skill development for an entire generation of kids. Kids who maybe were just born 1, 2 years old at the time of the beginning of the pandemic, depending on what it was like, where they lived, what it was like for their families. I think that we saw, a lot missing there for older kids as well. But, there's certain psychiatric conditions that clearly impact social skill development, autism clearly being the one that comes to mind most readily. But ADHD too, learning differences also. I think that you can see uneven social skills profiles from a lot of kids. The other thing that I'll mention about social skills is it's also imperative on us as a population to really figure out, like, what is the value we place on social skills and what are the social skills we place a value on, right? Right now, for example, when I trained, and it wasn't terribly long ago, right? Eye contact was like the biggest prereq social skill. Eye contact. Who cares? Is really the and I think that we are in this like period of transformation where, it's important to question those sorts of things, right? Social skills can be taught, certainly. They are very complex to teach, right? Human relationships are complex, but I think understanding the way our children connect and what they want socially is important. Not every kid enjoys being in the thick of it with 10 kids running around them. That's okay, right? Some kids are quieter. They stay on the sidelines, right? And that makes them happy. So, I think that there might be tons of things that cause social skills deficits, but if we're talking about treatment for that, it is really important to work together, everyone in that kid's life, to figure out, well, what are the things that we can work on, and getting that kid's buy-in as well, right? Like, what are the things they would like to improve? There are certainly social skills that are important for day-to-day functioning, right? If you need someone's attention, there are, it's clearly not appropriate for, an adult to like hit someone to get their attention, right? So I think we could draw the line in certain places, but also to understand that, like, things that we may have historically, interpreted to be here's the slate of social skills that we expect all, 5-year-olds to have. Well, maybe that looks a little different now, and that's okay.
And that is okay. And how can a parent or a professional tell the difference between a child that is shy or a child that needs more support or social, who lacks social skills?
So I think again, we're talking in, periods of time, right? Parents are again the experts on their children. They get to understand them really well. They know how they are in different environments, right? Like let's say you have a vibrant kid at home, loves to talk and chat and be kind of the center of attention and is really excited and all these things. And then you take that kid to school and they don't say a word to anyone, right? Okay, so when do we start to say that's a problem, right? Again, we'll go back to this 2-week mark, which I really like. There's this clinical term like slow to warm up. There are certainly kids that take time to, I'm a parent of one, so I think that every kid is on their own trajectory. I'm not a fan of this slow to warm up. It's whenever you feel like you want to be part of the group, you be part of the group. But I think if you have a kid who is so starkly different in different environments and that becomes distressing for them, right? Let's say you go to take your child to school and they are pushing back. There's some school refusal. And up until that point, they had been described as the teacher as super, super shy. We might be questioning, hey, is there something going on here? Maybe they need a little bit more support. But let's say you have a kid who's they're content. They sit in recess and they hang out with 1 or 2 kids, or sometimes they like to read a book. Like that's okay. We don't need to force kids into social relationships that they don't want to have, but we do need to make sure that if they are expressing a desire, right? Like they like to hang out with other kids, or they're sort of circling around them in the playground and you're noticing they just can't break in, then there are certainly things that we can do to support them in that.
What would that look like to support them in terms of IEP? So if again, parents and professionals are listening and they're thinking, can we address social skills, behavioral skills in an IEP?
Mm-hmm.
And the answer is yes. What would that look like? What have you seen written in an IEP that you think, and I know every scenario is different, so it may be a kind of a hard question, but have you kind of seen a theme that you're like, this really has supported either the social skills aspect or the behavioral aspect?
So I think when I talk with parents about social skills, when I talk with teachers about social skills, the model that I always really like is like, okay, well, let's assess, first of all, is it a question of them, feeling so much anxiety that they can't use the social skills they already have, right? Again, we have to look to the why. Or is it really like they want to hang out with other kids, but like they just like don't know how, can't figure out the best way to sort of come in. You'll get a lot of kids who do something big and behavioral to garner a lot of attention. That tends to be a big referral, right? So in those cases, us as professionals need to understand that there's something to be taught, right? That child is not a child that really has all the social skills they need to achieve their own social goals in their repertoire at the moment. So how do we teach those, right? So through an IEP, you could have goals for those. What I think is helpful is counseling, in-school counseling, that can be started in the office and possibly shifted into a push-in support for younger kids where that's not as stigmatizing. Small group counseling, 2 or 3 kids, where you can work on, understanding where others are going in play, and it's a smaller, quieter environment. On top of that, I am always encouraging parents to do one-on-one play dates outside of school with a child that their child has sort of said they might want to play with. I think that really translates into school. Actually, I think that's the best thing that translates into school is building those one-on-ones outside of school, and then coming into the school day, child feels more secure in that relationship. They're more likely to like go near that other kid on the playground. And sometimes it doesn't take that much, right? It's sort of just getting over that hump. But I think depending on the child's needs, it might be that the speech therapist is really supportive in that, or the occupational therapist is really supportive in that. Social skills groups are also a wonderful tool. I think that many parents sometimes think there's some version of a silver bullet. They're not. They're a tool like anything else is. but they provide a great place to practice. And practice is key for learning social skills. If you teach a child a social skill, or like, let's say the child's learning like, hey, can I play with you? Right. And that's the thing you want them to practice. You can create lots of opportunities for that child to practice, but be mindful if you're offering them an opportunity that's too anxiety provoking, right? Like, hey, it's a Saturday morning. We're just gonna like go to the playground where you don't know anyone and like practice this skill. I don't think, maybe that's not the best. So I think, again, it's about the collaboration, identifying what those skills are and where the child is in terms of their motivation to gain those skills.
So as we wrap up our conversation, what should I have asked you I didn't know enough to ask?
That's a good question. I think that something that I am very heavily focused on, my practice is pretty heavily focused on, is just the idea of understanding the neurodiverse community and what that means. Again, like I mentioned about the eye contact before, I think that it's okay for professionals to question some of the things that we were taught in our training, right? And for when we think about the best ways to support a child, to really look at that from a whole child perspective and what that kid likes, what that kid gravitates towards, and really be mindful if we are trying to teach something that maybe A, they don't need to learn, and B, they don't want to learn, right? So I think that that's the really important for me to say, is that, you know, we're all kind of on this journey together, I think, to understand and bring a new level of inclusivity into the work that we're doing. But there's a lot of new resources out there, but, you know, just to be constantly figuring out, well, what can we do better and what can we do differently?
So if you had a billboard that could have one tip for parents, what would it be and why?
So my number one tip for parents is choose your battles wisely. That is a billboard we could all use. I myself can use the billboard at certain times. I think there's a lot, we didn't talk a lot about parenting, but in general, there is a lot of stuff in the parenting space at the moment. We have gentle parenting. We have all kinds of people on social media, basically like, you know, giving tips for how to deal with a tantrum, how to deal with your child who doesn't want to do things. There's a lot of things there, right? But I mentioned it earlier and I'll say it again, that like pragmatism is really, really, really important. And choosing your battles wisely is the biggest parenting tool one could have, right? Because if you choose too many battles, you will burn out very, very, very fast. Not only will you burn out, you will not be able to hold your ground. I tell parents who sit in my office all the time that you lose 100% of the power struggles you take on with your child. Even if you got them to do the thing that you wanted them to do, you still wasted all this time fighting with them about something, right? If parents can get down the art of choosing their battles wisely, they will take on less of those battles, which is a lot of the professional work I do with parents. And when you take on less battles, you're more prepared to follow through and to set limits in an effective way.
And isn't it, you know, you choose your battles, you prioritize what you want to work on, and then, you know, you kind of slowly start chipping away down the list, and the priority shifts because then the behavior is shifting. And then as a parent, you have more energy, and then it becomes this more symbiotic relationship of working together.
Exactly.
Whew. But in the moment, it is hard.
It's hard.
We did not talk about parenting. We could talk about
It's really hard to be a parent. Yeah, it's really hard to be a parent.
It is very hard. And your information today has been incredibly powerful. And I really appreciate you providing these huge, huge nuggets of information to support families and professionals, and to really provide hope and to encouragement as well. Where can folks find you?
Sure. So our website is manhattanpsychologygroup.com. Our website is extraordinarily informative. There are blog posts on there. There's lists of all the resources that we recommend. You can see bios of all the therapists. I will mention that many of our therapists, myself included, are licensed in multiple states. We provide telehealth services if you're not local to Manhattan, which is where we are. But yeah, that's a really excellent starting off point.
And I'm glad that you shared that you're licensed in multiple states so that you can share this empowerment with folks that are listening that may not be in New York. So I am so grateful for your time and thankful that you came to talk with us today. And I can't wait for other folks to listen and rewind and listen again to get a lot of information.
Well, thank you for having me. This was great.
You bet. Thanks for listening. Man, that was super informative. My strategy takeaway for today was to ensure that we are validating emotions and behaviors, that we look for trends and behaviors, and ensure that we start to collaborate with that school team, and understanding and outlining the complexity of social skills and really kind of thinking through what every specific child needs to ensure that they're able to connect with the world around them. Thank you again for strategizing with us and sharing your earbud space. If you love what you've heard, give us a like and follow at Learning Essentials. I want you to also head over to learningessentialsedu.com, and you will find free tips to prepare for an IEP meeting, plus bonus questions to ask. I hope these strategies help make it a great day. Until next time.